This proof is going to be completed using a do whatever you legally can strategy, but I'm going to suggest ways to make that strategy a little bit more efficient, especially now that we have almost a full set of rules. Part of making this strategy a little bit more efficient is the same as always. Identify things like your main operators, identify where your conclusion might be coming from, and just make any observations that you can. When we're looking at these particular premises, I think two of the things that stick out is that the D and the E do kind of stick out. They're not clearly related to the conclusion at all, and they're not clearly related to other components of the premises. Now, the premises as they are, it may not be readily evident exactly how you're going to make use of them in the first place. But the fact that D only occurs in line 1 and nowhere else, and that E also occurs only in a single line, it's a clue that maybe those will be extraneous. Now, in terms of doing whatever you can, we're just looking for legal options here. And if we just go in order and we take a look at line 1, distribution is a legal and obvious option. Now, this is where we can try to gain a little efficiency in terms of using this strategy. Distribution on line 1 would mean that we can derive D and A or D and C. And not only did we previously note that the D is a little bit of a sore thumb, and what we're doing here is, in a sense, getting more Ds, but we're also deriving a disjunction with no obvious matches to anything else that we have. That is to say, for example, if we wanted to use DS, we would need to have the negation of D and A, but again, D doesn't show up anywhere else in our proof, and so it's not clear that the negation of both D and A is something that we're ever going to be able to derive. Now, fair enough, in more complex proofs, just because something doesn't readily look like it's going to be useful doesn't mean that we can completely write it off. But in terms of narrowing your options, if you can anticipate a line or two down the road from that option, and you see that it's not really going to go anywhere, then at least put it to the side for now. Now, if we're still looking at line 1, simp is also an option. Now, what we're deriving from simp is either or both A or C, and then also D. Now, again, chances are we don't need to simplify to derive D. A or C, however, should stay on your radar. And this is because not only do we have a C somewhere else in the proof, but that C is part of a disjunction that is then negated. In other words, De Morgan's on line 2 is going to allow us to derive not C, also using simp, and once we do have not C, then we've got a potential for DS here. From a proof discovery perspective, what I just did here is a multi-step process. I was trying to play around with what I could derive from line 1, and in so doing I had to also look at line 2. This is where knowledge of the rules and a little bit of proof experience just speeds up, and again here makes more efficient your proof discovery process. And if we think about efficiency again, and the fact that we're using a do whatever you legally can proof, you know, not E from simp is also a legal option, but for the same reasons that D didn't look very attractive to us, not E isn't going to look very attractive here either. It just doesn't appear, neither E nor not E appear anywhere else in the proof so far, and so it's just not clear how that would be a productive line. And it may be that at this point even you have enough resources here that you know how the proof is going to play out, but if we stick with the strategy, then we just keep looking. Is there something else that we can legally do with line 2? Well, of course. I mean, with all the implication rules and all the replacement rules, we could, for example, use com on line 2 or implication on line 2. So how do you rule them out? Well, similar to what we did up here with distribution, it's about being able to anticipate whether or not com will provide something a little bit more useful than what you already have. But also, since we're at a point where we're making some progress, we have a viable option for line 2. It also makes sense to go ahead and look at what we might be able to do with line 3. And if we add line 3 into the mix, again, legal options include things like using imp or com, or for that matter, maybe even add. But relying on the work that we've already done here, we see that if we really do use D on A or C and not C, then what we're going to get is A. A is the opposite of this left-hand disjunct, and so DS on line 3 and some version of A, and we've talked about this a couple of times, it's of course going to be not A that we actually need. But in terms of discovering proof strategies, recognize that DS is a potential move here, is all that we really need. DS is going to permit the derivation of our desired conclusion. And so then there's our proof, roughly speaking. Remember that whenever you transfer over your thought process into the actual proof, you always want to double check your steps, double check your rules. Case in point, this is, it's in actually constructing the proof that you might catch some of these double negation steps or find that you do need an extra intermediate derivation or two. So at this point, we're ready to try to construct the proof. And for the most part, we can usually follow along with our thought process. There may be some tweaking. Case in point, if you hadn't anticipated that you would need a DN line in order to use DS, that fact would very likely come out as you're trying to complete the proof and double checking your rule usages as you go along. And so in terms of our thought process, we first thought we would use simp on line 1 to derive A or C. Simp would also allow the derivation of D, but again, we didn't anticipate that D would be any use to us, so I'm going to go ahead and skip it in the proof as well. If you derived D using simp on line 1 at line 5, that's totally legal and it's fine to keep in your proof. But in terms of the thought process outlined here, we didn't think we would need D. Instead, we moved on to De Morgan's on line 2. De Morgan's, remember, is the triple switch when we're pushing through the negation, so to say. Each of the component sentences gets its value switched, so to say. So that means that C, since it doesn't have a negation in line 2, gets a negation. E, which doesn't have a negation in line 2, gets a negation. And then the last part of this triple switch is that the operator also changes. The wedge becomes a dot. De Morgan's then allows us to derive not C from line 5 using simp. And here again, simp would also allow the derivation of not E, but we don't anticipate needing not E in the rest of our proof. The next piece in our thought process was to use DS. Now in the thought process, DS was a few lines down the road, and so we don't have line numbers here, but we know that it's DS on A or C and not C. So we just go back and pick up those lines wherever they are. A or C appears on line 4, and not C appears on a line by itself at line 6, and what we're deriving is A. And then lastly, or strictly speaking, almost lastly, and we want to use DS on line 3 and the line that contains A. DS looks like this. It says given a disjunction and the negation of its left-hand disjunct, you're allowed to derive the remaining disjunct. Well, the left-hand disjunct is not A, and so the negation of that left-hand disjunct is going to be not A. We know how to get not A, and of course from there, that means we're allowed to derive B from line 3 and 8 DS. Just to summarize a little bit, the proof strategy here relied on doing what you legally can, and bear in mind that knowledge of what you legally can do is premised on your knowledge of the rules. So make sure that you always have your rule sheet with you and that you know the rules well enough that you can look at line 2 and know what the options are. Look at line 1, know what the options are, so on and so forth. To make doing what you legally can a little bit more efficient, though, you do want to focus always on your conclusion. Doing so in this case, for example, allowed us to rule out distribution. And then lastly, it helps to be able to anticipate a few lines down the road. In this case, for example, being able to see forward, being able to anticipate a few lines means that when we saw that we could derive A or C, we could see that DM on line 2 would be productive.